All right, welcome to our explainer. In this masterclass, we're going to dive deep and build a complete, totally exam-ready understanding of the cerebral cortex. We'll go from its most basic parts all the way to its most complex functions. By the time we're done, you'll have this incredible structure mapped out perfectly in your head. Let's get started.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We've got 6 key sections. First up, we'll lay the groundwork with the absolute foundations, gray and white matter. From there, we'll zoom out to look at the anatomy of the cortex itself. Then, we're going to trace the brain's internal wiring by looking at its fiber tracks. Once we have the structure down pat, we'll start mapping out the brain's functions, and we'll really zero in on the motor and sensory areas. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a close look at the brain's CEO, the prefrontal cortex.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the foundations. Before we can even begin to understand the really complex stuff the cortex does, we've got to get the basics down cold. That means the core materials and the specific language neuroscientists use to talk about the brain.
Okay, first things first, we need to get our bearings. This slide shows the key directions we'll be using throughout this whole thing. Dorsal, or superior, means the top. Ventral, or inferior, means the bottom. Rostral, or anterior, points toward the front, and caudal, or posterior, points toward the back. Really try to lock this mental map in your head, because we're going to be using these terms a lot as we move forward. Now here are 3 terms you absolutely have to know. Inside the central nervous system, the CNS, a group of neuron cell bodies is called a nucleus. A bundle of the wires connecting them, the axons, is called a tract. Now, if you go outside the CNS to the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, a group of neuron cell bodies is called ganglia. So see, nucleus and ganglia are both just collections of cell bodies. The only difference is where they are. Make sure you pay super close attention to nucleus and tract because they're the building blocks for the gray and white matter we're about to discuss.
And here we go. This cross-section gives you a perfect look at the brain's 2 main types of tissue. See that darker stuff that makes up the outer layer? That's the gray matter, which forms the cortex. And the lighter colored tissue deep inside? That's the white matter. This split is absolutely fundamental to understanding how the brain is put together.
So what's the real difference between them? Let's break it down. Gray matter is made of all those neuron cell bodies. This is where the thinking happens, the processing and cognition. You find it in that outer layer, the cerebral cortex, and also in these deep clusters called the basal nuclei, like the caudate and lentiform nuclei. White matter, on the other hand, is made of those fiber tracks, the axons we just talked about. Its whole job is communication, connecting everything. It's located deep inside, underneath the cortex. So you can think of it like this. The gray matter is kind of like all the computers, and the white matter? That's all the Ethernet cables hooking everything together.
Okay, on to Section 2. We've defined the basic materials of the brain. Now let's zoom out a bit and look at the big picture, the macroscopic structure of the cerebral cortex itself. We're going to focus on why it has that incredibly unique folded look.
You know, the sheer scale of the cortex is just mind-blowing. Its total surface area is around 2,200 square centimeters, which is about 2.5 square feet. But get this, and this is the crazy part. 2/3 of that entire surface area is actually hidden away, tucked inside all of those folds. And even though it's only about 1.5 to 3 millimeters thick, it weighs 600 grams, which is a whopping 40% of the entire brain's weight. And crammed inside that tiny layer are an estimated 100 billion neurons and an absolutely staggering 1 trillion glial cells.
This picture right here does a great job of showing us what all those folds are called. Any of the elevated ridges is called a gyrus, and the plural of that is gyri. Any shallow groove or depression is a sulcus, the plural is sulci, and when you have a really, really deep groove, that's called a fissure. This whole folding system is what lets the brain pack such a massive surface area into a relatively small scope.
All right, let's jump into Section 3. We've looked at the cortex, the gray matter processing centers, so now it's time to check out the white matter, the wiring that connects everything. This whole section is about how information gets from point A to point B through the brain's massive network.
So this white matter wiring comes in 3 main flavors, and it's all based on what they connect. First, you have commissurial fibers. Their job is to connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Second, there are association fibers. These connect different areas but all within the same hemisphere. And third, you have projection fibers, which connect the cortex to other lower parts of the brain and even the spinal cord.
And this image, wow, it just lays it all out perfectly. First, just look at that bottom view, the anterior one. That huge band of fibers connecting the 2 halves of the brain,
That's the corpus callosum. It's the biggest bundle of commissural fibers there is. Now look at the side view, the lateral one. You can see things called longitudinal fasciculi. Those are long association fibers. And finally, you can see the projection fibers of the internal capsule, which are like superhighways for information going to and from the cortex.
Okay, let's drill down on this a little more. Association fibers actually come in two types. You have short ones, called arcuate fibers, that just connect neighboring gyri. Then you have long ones, or longitudinal fibers, that connect areas that are much farther apart, sometimes even in different lobes. Projection fibers are sorted by their direction of travel. You've got corticofugal, think fugitive, fleeing, or efferent fibers. These are exiting the cortex, heading down to the brainstem or spinal cord. And then you have corticopedal, or afferent fibers. These are entering the cortex, and they usually come from the thalamus.
And that brings us perfectly to section 4. We've got the physical structure down, and we've covered the internal wiring. So now we can ask the big question. What's it all for? What does it actually do? Let's switch gears to function and see how different parts of the cortex are specialized for very specific jobs.
So one of the first big ideas when we talk about function is something called hemispheric lateralization. It's just the idea that the two halves of your brain aren't mirror images when it comes to their jobs. For most people, the left hemisphere tends to be dominant for things like reading, writing, and math, as well as logic, decision-making, and especially speech and language. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is usually the star player when it comes to recognizing faces and voices, visual and spatial reasoning, and processing emotion and artistic skills.
So where did this whole idea of mapping the brain come from? Well, it was really pioneered by this guy right here, Corbinian Brodmann, back around 1909. What he did was incredible. He painstakingly studied the cellular structure, or what's called the cytoarchitecture, of the cortex. And based on tiny differences in how the cells were arranged, he was able to divide the entire cortex into 52 different areas, creating the now famous Brodmann map that you see on the right.
And what is just so incredible is that this map he made based on cells, it lines up almost perfectly with function. Let's just walk through this table, it's fascinating. So for vision, the main primary processing happens right in area 17. Then that information gets sent to the secondary areas for more advanced processing, areas 18, 19, 20, 21, and 37. For audition, or hearing, the primary spot is area 41, with secondary processing in 22 and 42. For body sensation, the primary cortex is actually made up of 3 areas, 1, 2, and 3, with secondary areas in 5 and 7. And finally, for motor control, the primary area is 4, and the secondary motor area is 6. This system is still a cornerstone of neuroscience today.
Okay, let's move on to section 5. We're going to zoom right in on those major functional areas we just mapped out, and we'll get into the specifics of what the motor, sensory, and the association areas of the cortex really do.
Okay, check this out. We're looking at 2 of the most important strips of real estate in the entire brain. The primary motor cortex is located on the precentral gyrus, which is in the frontal lobe. Its job is to control all your voluntary movements. Then, right behind it, just on the other side of that big central sulcus, you've got the primary somatosensory cortex, on the postcentral gyrus. Its job is to receive all the incoming sensory info from your body, things like touch, pressure, and pain.
And this brings us to a really famous and kind of weird concept called somatopy, which is shown perfectly by this little guy, the motor homunculus. This is basically a map of your body laid out across the motor cortex. But you can see how totally distorted it is, right? The size of each body part on the map isn't about its physical size, it's about how much of the cortex is dedicated to its fine motor control. That's why, the hands and the face are just gigantic on this map. They need incredibly precise control.
But here's the thing. These maps are not set in stone. They have this amazing ability called cortical plasticity. Take a look at the diagram on the left. This shows what we call use-dependent expansion. If you practice a task that needs fine finger control, like playing an instrument, the part of your cortex that represents your fingers will literally get bigger. Now look at the diagram on the right. This shows what happens after an amputation. If an arm is lost, that huge patch of cortex doesn't just go dark. Instead, the areas next to it, for the face and shoulder, will actually expand and take over that unused neural territory. It's incredible.
All right, and here we are at our final section, number 6. We're going to take a closer look at the prefrontal cortex. This is the most complex, the most recently evolved, and you could argue the most human part of the entire cerebral cortex. It's responsible for all of our so-called executive functions.
So you can really think of the prefrontal cortex as the CEO of the brain. It takes in information from all the other association areas and uses it to run our highest level functions: our intellect, our ability to plan and reason, our mood, and our judgment. It's absolutely essential for predicting the consequences of our actions and for developing a conscience. Its importance was famously and tragically highlighted in the historical case of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker whose entire personality changed after an iron rod shot through his prefrontal cortex. This region was also the target of the prefrontal leucotomy, better known as the frontal lobotomy, which was developed by Antonio Egas Moniz.
So, I want to leave you with a final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. We've seen how specific parts of the cortex are linked to very specific functions, all leading up to the prefrontal cortex as the home of our highest abilities. So the question is this: if all of that stuff, our personality, our judgment, our conscience, is really just a product of the biological wiring in this one part of our brain, what does that really say about the nature of the self?